Hi, I'm Tom Buckholtz. Thank you for attending this seminar, Messaging Matters, a checklist to enhance buy-in for your ideas. Actually, you can use the checklist not only to enhance marketing and messaging, but also to reflect on and hopefully capture opportunities throughout your business and personal life. During this seminar, I will introduce aspects of checklists, introduce myself, provide examples of work that I've participated in, discuss one main checklist, reinterpret the examples using the checklist, allude to other checklists and various uses of checklists, and hopefully help you create a wide range of opportunities for you to think well and do great. Regarding my work, people invited me into high potential situations. Together, we created more than people expected within businesses, in government, in research and development, for the environment, and for society. I've worked with large and small enterprises in more than a dozen fields. My experience includes working with small startups and leading a $1 billion per year in revenue, 2,000-person business unit. My checklists reflect hopefully useful experience and perspective that I have gained from such activities. Perhaps you saw the introductory video for this seminar. There, I developed a checklist about messaging. I suggested that if you're trying to enthuse a client about an opportunity that you present, your client needs to know of the opportunity, but that's not enough. Your client needs to think about the opportunity, but that's not enough. You want the client to go for the opportunity. Your messaging can be aimed at each of these three activities. The video also suggested that your client has precursors to know and successors to go. You may also want to address those opportunities. Here are the 4 examples that I'll introduce momentarily. Later, we'll come back and work with the examples and the main checklist underlying this seminar. One example involves the foci for a company-wide grassroots innovation program. Another example involves the mission statement and other aspects of a large business unit. Another involves leading a meeting, and another is close to the theme for the seminar. This one is help your customer buy your product. In 1982, people in the computer department of an energy utility recognized that personal computing was likely to become very useful throughout business. They weren't quite sure what the utility should do, but they did hire me to catalyze some sort of program throughout the company. It turned out that would be a grassroots innovation program. After I'd been there for a while, I realized it was time to do more messaging about what the program might be. And I also realized that too many of the conversations that I was involved in seemed to stay with, maybe end with, the topic of technology. I developed a 5-word slide that I used originally for talks inside the company, and then eventually for talks outside the company also. I would explain that important in this project were results for the company, customers, and employees, human infrastructure, that's people, learning, teamwork, sharing, innovation, and indeed technology, but technology is perhaps third on the list. In 1989, I became a presidential administration appointee in the United States federal government. I served as a commissioner in the United States General Services Administration. The group that I led included 100 people, who, along with perhaps a half dozen people in the Office of Management and Budget, provided the Chief Information Officer function for the 4 million person executive branch of the federal government. Another part of my group was a 2,000 person, billion-dollar a year in revenue business unit. We sold information-related services, telecommunications services, and information technology professional services, in this case, to all three branches of government. When I got there, GSA was just coming out of an era of strategic and tactical planning. I, in effect, inherited a draft mission statement, strategic plan, and tactical plan for my group, which, by the way, had more functions than the ones I just mentioned. I looked at the mission statement. The theme was something like fostering an information-rich environment for perhaps 4 million people throughout the federal government. I liked the idea of information. That certainly was better than quality products and services. But within a few seconds, my mind went from information-rich to information overload. I knew there might be a problem. I knew there was not time to send this back into the group for work, so I decided to work on this myself. I developed a mission statement around a theme that I called information proficiency, or the effective use of information. I put in images of proficiency with information to make decisions and thereby set goals, and proficiency through information to communicate and implement the decisions and thereby achieve results inherent in the goals. After my federal service, my wife and I moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area and settled in Silicon Valley. I've done a variety of things here. Some of that has been coaching for startups, and I recall serving on an advisory board for one software-related startup. The CEO founder decided that he had taken the company about as far as he could. He hired somebody else to be the new CEO. That person had had a track record of building a successful startup. I realized that the new CEO was good at introducing topics for meeting segments, but that the conversations tended to drift thereafter. So I gave him some coaching about what else he could do to help steer meeting segments. While I was working with the energy utility, I realized how difficult it can actually be to buy a product. We could agree with the vendor about what we were going to get, how much we were going to pay for it, and roughly how long after signing a contract it would be before we received the products or services. Unfortunately, it would then take months to negotiate a contract. I realized that I might be able to do something about this. I catalyzed on behalf of the company a speech for myself to a monthly sales and marketing breakfast unit for the American Electronics Association group in Silicon Valley. I entitled the talk, "Help Your Customer Buy Your Product." My hope was to catalyze some sort of working group so that people could help each other become better at selling products and services. Well, how can we generalize from those examples and build a checklist? One generalization is to think about endeavors, and when people do so, often the description becomes something like entities do things. I think that by now you can recognize that there's something very important that's missing in this generalization. In case you need a hint, here's an idea that I distilled from the caption in a cartoon. It basically boiled down to the idea management outsourced brainstorming. So here's a checklist for thinking about, reflecting on, and improving an endeavor. One wants to do great. In order to do so, one needs to think well. And in order to think well and do great, one needs to be apt. That's people, it's data, it's energy, it's computer systems, it's office space, it's all the infrastructure that you need in order to think well and do great. Let's build the main checklist for this seminar. I call the checklist State Progress. To build this checklist, we're going to apply the checklist Do Great, Think Well, and Be Apt to itself 3 times. Here, we built the state progress checklist. The do application under do great is to foster reuses of things that occur during the endeavor, outside the endeavor. The think part is to recognize outcomes that the endeavor can or has achieved. The be part is to perform the actions that lead to being able to recognize outcomes. For the think well part, the do part is to choose plans. The think part is to build scenarios that can become components of plans. And the be part is to work with assumptions. And sometimes those assumptions are ones you can recognize, sometimes they're subconscious and will never be recognized. For be apt, the do part is teamwork and guiding interactions that can do all the stuff above. The think part is for people to motivate them, to help them motivate themselves. And the be part involves all of those resources that we mentioned before. The graphic suggests a few things. Number one, there's more value for things higher up on this chart very often than there is for things below that. So results add going up the chart. Another idea is that every once in a while you might want to stop and plan downward. You can plan in any direction from anything in this chart, but planning downward can be especially useful. Here is the state progress checklist. I've extracted the nouns from the typical activities and turned them into themes. And I put in a place to suggest that you might want for each of the 9 categories, or for the ones that seem to be important at least, to note instances of things that you think are significant, either to work on, or because you've achieved them, or for whatever reason. Let's see what we can learn from the 4 examples about the examples themselves and about how to use the checklist. For the Energy Utilities Grassroots Innovation Program, here's an attempt to place the 3 foci relative to outcomes for the company. You might choose to put human infrastructure in a different category or to spread it out across some categories. I think that this slide illustrates that it was quite important to have a discussion of the 3 foci. Each innovation had a champion. In order for the innovation project to get the technology they needed, they sent a form to my group. There was a place for a paragraph about the work that the company does that the innovation would impact. There was a place for a paragraph about anticipated improvements and a paragraph for the risks of not doing the innovation. And of course, there was a list of the anticipated technology that would be needed. The champion also needed to estimate an annual financial benefit to the company and obtain an officer's signature. In this way, the champion marketed their idea through the chain of command to a company officer, and they also happened to market the overall innovation program that I was championing. Less than 3.5 years after I joined the company, I gave a talk to the officers of the company. Amazingly enough, I had met all of them, including the CEO retiring and the CEO designate, except for the general counsel, before I gave that talk. The punchline on the talk was actually quite effective. It was one slide, and I said that we had 5,000 computers, meaning mostly personal computers. I had spent $20 million of the company's money, and, quote, you here in this room, unquote, have signed off on $100 million in recurring annual corporate benefits. In retrospect, I think the company revenue at that time was about $6 billion a year. Here, again, relative to corporate outcomes, I placed 2 other aspects of the project. One was that about the time I came up with the 3 foci, we came up with 7 principles for the program. These principles became quite important as far as messaging and marketing regarding the program. They also became important regarding decision making. So once in a while, for example, I got a proposal for an innovation project and it didn't quite fit the principles, so I could use the principles to, in effect, override an officer's signature and indicate that we were not going to do that particular innovation concept. Also, looking outside the company in the reuse area, it turns out that I pioneered a new marketplace practice for the world software marketplace with something that might be called the corporate or enterprise software license. Here, I show one way to evaluate candidate mission statements for the group that I led in the General Services Administration. Proficiency through information is about performing actions that achieve the outcomes the government will achieve. Proficiency with information is about planning to achieve those outcomes. Information-rich environment, you might put it somewhere else, but I tend to think of it as infrastructure and resources. Regarding the coaching for leading a meeting or meeting segment, I don't quite remember the details, other than the person did become much better at leading meeting segments. But let me use state progress to indicate how you might come up with themes for meeting segments, themes beyond the topic. So in the outcomes arena, you might have a theme of we're going to announce a decision and celebrate the fact that we've gotten there. Or as you go down the list, you can see some rather natural things. Make the decision, set plan to make the decision, discuss how to make the decision, so on and so forth. Team building can be a theme for a meeting segment. Enthusing people, perhaps a motivational speaker, can be a theme for a meeting segment, even upgrading one's technology. Regarding your marketing your idea to a prospective client, early in this talk I suggested that there were successors to go and predecessors to know. Here I placed go at the stage of outcomes, whoever buys into your whatever, and I suggest a successor. There's a lot more that can happen after they actually buy into your idea. For example, you and they can work together to implement their needs based on your product or service. You can market each other's successes and so on and so forth. And I think if you look farther down the list, you can see a lot of predecessors to the stage of no. For example, if you have a really new idea that people aren't really expecting, then in fact you may have to help them in terms of the resources, motivations, and interactions to even assemble a team that can consider your idea. You might want to use state progress to reflect on and maybe even change the products and services that you offer. You might think of a client. You might think of that client recognizing that it achieves something meaningful for itself, and then use the checklist to place the value added by your products and services. Then you can look and say, do I want to move the products and services somewhat upscale or downscale, or am I happy with where they are now? Let me offer some thoughts about telecommunications and computing. Telecommunications early on was just about connecting things together and sending messages. I'd suggest that it fit in the resources category. Early on, computer systems became attempts to move upscale, so they were vertical as opposed to horizontal, but they tended to evolve in rather narrow niches and silos. For your own products and services, you might want not only to place them on a scale such as this, but also to think about the extent to which they are becoming commodity, low margin products and services. And maybe moving upscale would help keep them as higher margin and higher value added. Perhaps You are recognizing that state progress has many uses, and that in general, you can use it to think well and do great. Along with thinking about opportunities to use state progress, you might want to also consider opportunities to use other checklists and thinking tools, ones you know and ones I'm about to talk about. State progress is but one of a number of checklists that I call direct outcomes checklists. Let's talk about a technique, which I call two brains, tell it and sell it, and then other direct outcomes checklists. To develop a compelling message, you may want to consider both the practical appeal, that's the tell it aspect, and the emotional appeal, that's the sell it aspect. By the way, you may have noticed that so far we've been using state progress to discuss mainly practical appeal or tell it. When you develop candidate messages, you might ask people to place them on a grid that looks like the grid that you're seeing here. Ideally, you might want to have a message that ranks very high on practical appeal. That's the very positive right side of the array. And you might want to have a message that ranks closer to sizzles than fizzles. That means high up on the array. There are 11 direct outcomes checklists. For each checklist, I chose one of the many questions that it can help resolve about an endeavor. Then I ranked the questions using state progress and developed the slide that you see here. For example, if you want to ask the question, to what extent does an endeavor appropriately coordinate with other endeavors, you might want to consult the checklist state synergies. Or for declaring value for constituents, you might want to reflect using the checklist state impact. Progress toward creating value, well, there's state progress. Or maybe you're interested in the use of information, you might want to try state assumptions first. In any event, all the questions are good. All the checklists are good for essentially all the questions, but this is a good way to think about things and get started. And in fact, you may find that the 11 questions are a really meaningful checklist in themselves about an endeavor. I've developed a variety of items about direct outcomes. You might want to search for them on the web using Buckholtz direct outcomes. If you're viewing this seminar as part of a scheduled presentation, it's just about time for discussion. In any event, I hope that someday you will tell me about successes you have catalyzed based on what you learned during this seminar.